The gilded halls of Versailles had fallen silent. The woman who once commanded armies of servants with a mere glance now sat alone in a cell barely fit for rats. But what happened to Marie Antoinette in her final months wasn't just execution. It was systematic destruction of everything she had ever been. The revolutionaries didn't simply want her dead. They wanted to obliterate the very idea of her existence, to transform the most famous queen in Europe into something less than human before they took her life. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the French Revolution's most notorious victim. This isn't the sanitized version taught in history books. This is the brutal reality of how a civilization can turn against one person with such calculated cruelty that it defies comprehension. By the time we reach the end of this story, you'll understand why Marie Antoinette's final act of defiance became one of the most powerful moments in human history. The year was 1793, and Paris had become a city drunk on blood. The guillotine worked overtime in the Place de la Révolution, its blade falling with mechanical precision on the necks of aristocrats, clergy, and anyone deemed an enemy of the new republic. But among all these executions, one stood apart. The death of Marie Antoinette wasn't just another political killing. It was the culmination of decades of hatred, carefully orchestrated to be the most humiliating spectacle possible. To understand the depths of cruelty inflicted upon her, we must first grasp who she had been. Marie Antoinette arrived in France as a teenage bride, a political pawn in the marriage alliance between Austria and France. She was 14 years old when she crossed the border, stripped naked in a ceremonial tent to remove every trace of her Austrian origins before being dressed in French clothes. This symbolic transformation would prove prophetic. Her entire life would be about losing pieces of herself until nothing remained. For 20 years, she reigned as Queen of France, becoming the perfect scapegoat for a nation's economic collapse and social upheaval. The French people needed someone to blame for their suffering, and this foreign queen with her extravagant lifestyle became the ideal target. Vicious pamphlets circulated through Paris, depicting her as a monster of sexual depravity and political treachery. They called her the Austrian whore, claiming she was bankrupting France to fund Austria's wars. None of it was entirely true, but truth mattered less than the narrative of hatred being constructed around her. When revolution erupted in 1789, Marie Antoinette found herself trapped in a nightmare that would consume 4 years of her life. The royal family was imprisoned first at the Tuileries Palace, then moved to the medieval Temple prison. Here, the systematic humiliation began in earnest. The former queen was forced to cook, clean, and mend clothes like a common servant. Guards watched her constantly, noting her every movement, her every word, building evidence for the trial that would inevitably come. But the real torture wasn't physical, it was psychological. Revolutionary authorities understood that breaking Marie Antoinette's spirit was more valuable than simply killing her body. They began by stripping away her children, the most precious things in her world. Her eldest son, Louis Joseph, had already died of illness before the revolution. Now they systematically separated her from those who remained. First came the attack on her daughter. Marie-Thérèse, barely 15 years old, was subjected to interrogations designed to turn her against her mother. Revolutionary guards would burst into their shared cell at random hours, dragging the terrified girl away for questioning about her mother's supposed crimes. They wanted the daughter to testify against her parent, to provide evidence of treason and conspiracy. The girl refused every time, but the psychological warfare took its toll on both mother and child. Then came the ultimate cruelty. In July 1793, they took her youngest child, 8-year-old Louis Charles. This little boy, heir to the throne that no longer existed, became the revolutionaries' most powerful weapon against his mother. They didn't simply imprison him, they transformed him into an instrument of destruction against the woman who had given him life. The child was placed under the care of Antoine Simon, a cobbler chosen specifically for his crude manner and republican fervor. Simon's job was to corrupt the young prince, to strip away every trace of royal education and replace it with revolutionary ideology. They forced the boy to wear the red cap of liberty, taught him revolutionary songs, and made him curse his parents as enemies of the people. But this wasn't enough for their purposes. Revolutionary authorities needed the child to provide testimony against his mother, testimony that would justify the extreme punishment they planned to inflict. Through a combination of psychological manipulation, threats, and possibly physical coercion, they extracted from this 8-year-old boy a statement that would haunt history. They forced him to accuse his mother of sexual impropriety, of teaching him inappropriate behaviors, of corrupting his innocence in ways that were too vile to speak aloud in court. The child didn't understand what he was being made to say. He was a traumatized little boy, separated from everyone he loved, surrounded by people who told him his parents were evil monsters deserving death. Under this pressure, he signed documents he couldn't read, making accusations he couldn't comprehend. For Marie Antoinette, learning of her son's forced testimony was worse than any physical torture they could have devised. Meanwhile, her conditions in the temple prison grew increasingly harsh. The medieval fortress had been converted into a revolutionary stronghold, its thick walls echoing with the sounds of guards playing cards, drinking, and making crude jokes about their royal prisoners. Privacy became non-existent. Marie Antoinette couldn't change clothes, use the bathroom, or even sleep without being watched by men whose job was to document her every moment of vulnerability. The food was deliberately poor: thin soup, stale bread, and water that often carried disease. The former queen, who had once dined on delicacies prepared by the finest chefs in Europe, now fought off hunger with scraps fit for animals. Her health began to deteriorate rapidly. She developed severe headaches, possibly from malnutrition and stress. Her hair, once her pride and styled by the most fashionable artists in Paris, began falling out in clumps. Sleep became nearly impossible. The guards would deliberately make noise throughout the night, slamming doors, shouting conversations, rattling keys. When she did manage to drift off, they would wake her with sudden inspections, searches for contraband, or demands that she answer questions about her supposed crimes. This sleep deprivation was another weapon in their arsenal of psychological torture, designed to break down her mental resistance and make her more likely to confess to crimes she hadn't committed. By August 1793, the revolutionaries decided that Marie Antoinette had served her purpose as a symbol of royal oppression. Her husband, King Louis XVI, had already been executed in January, his death marking the official end of the monarchy. Now it was her turn, but they wanted her final destruction to be even more complete than his had been. The king's execution had been swift and dignified, a recognition of his former status, even as they took his life. For the queen, they planned something far more degrading. On the night of August 2nd, 1793, guards burst into Marie Antoinette's cell at the Temple prison. They told her she was being transferred immediately to new accommodations. She was given no time to gather belongings, no opportunity to say goodbye to her daughter or sister-in-law. Rough hands grabbed her arms and dragged her through the corridors she had walked for 4 years, past cells that had become grimly familiar, toward a fate she could only imagine. The carriage that awaited her wasn't the royal coach she had once taken for granted. It was a common prison wagon, its wooden sides scarred and stained with the fear and desperation of countless previous occupants. As the wheels began to turn, carrying her through the darkened streets of Paris, Marie Antoinette understood that this journey marked the beginning of her final act. The Temple prison had been harsh, but it had still maintained some pretense of treating her as a person of significance. Where she was going now, even that minimal dignity would be stripped away. The conciergerie prison loomed ahead in the darkness, its medieval towers casting long shadows across the Seine River. Known throughout Paris as the antechamber to death, this fortress had become the final stop for enemies of the revolution. Its cells had held thousands of prisoners over the centuries, most of whom had walked from its gates directly to the scaffold. As the carriage rolled through its iron gates, Marie Antoinette was about to discover just how far human cruelty could extend when fueled by revolutionary fervor and years of accumulated hatred. The woman who entered the conciergerie that night was no longer recognizable as the glittering queen who had once danced at Versailles. But the worst was yet to come. Over the next 76 days, her captors would orchestrate a campaign of degradation so systematic, so calculated in its cruelty, that it would shock even hardened revolutionaries. What happened within those prison walls would test the limits of human endurance and reveal truths about both the depths of hatred and the surprising strength of the human spirit when faced with ultimate adversity. The cell that awaited Marie Antoinette in the conciergerie was a deliberate insult to everything she had once represented. Measuring barely 12 feet by 8 feet, this cramped stone chamber reeked of centuries of human misery. Water seeped through the ancient walls, creating pools of stagnant moisture that bred disease and despair. The single window, barred and positioned too high to offer any view of the outside world, allowed only thin shafts of grey light to penetrate the gloom. But the physical squalor was merely the beginning of her torment. The revolutionaries had designed every aspect of her imprisonment to systematically destroy her sense of self, her dignity, and her humanity. They assigned her the number 280, reducing the former Queen of France to a mere digit in their ledger of the condemned. This wasn't accidental bureaucracy. It was psychological warfare of the most calculated kind. 2 guards were stationed inside her cell at all times, their eyes never leaving her. These weren't ordinary prison guards, but carefully selected men whose job was to document every moment of her existence. They watched her eat the thin gruel that passed for food. They observed her struggle to maintain basic hygiene with the meager supplies provided. Most humiliatingly, they monitored her most private bodily functions, making notes in their daily reports about the former queen's most vulnerable moments. The guards spoke about her as if she weren't there, discussing her appearance, her habits, her evident despair with the casual cruelty of men who had been trained to see her as less than human. They would comment on how her hair had thinned, how her skin had taken on the pale, sickly hue of prolonged imprisonment, how her hands shook when she tried to hold the wooden spoon they provided for her meals. Every observation was designed to strip away another layer of the dignity she fought desperately to maintain. Privacy became a luxury from a distant past. The makeshift screen they provided for her to change clothes was deliberately positioned so the guards could observe her silhouette. When she protested, they reminded her that enemies of the Republic had forfeited any right to modesty. The message was clear. Her body, like her life, belonged to the revolution now. They could observe it, judge it, and ultimately destroy it at their pleasure. The nights were perhaps the worst part of her ordeal. The guards would deliberately keep lanterns burning, ensuring that sleep became nearly impossible. When exhaustion finally overcame her, and she began to drift off on the straw mattress that served as her bed, they would wake her with sudden noises, unexpected inspections, or demands that she answer questions about her supposed crimes. This sleep deprivation wasn't accidental. It was a refined technique of psychological torture designed to break down her mental defenses. Her meals were delivered at irregular intervals, sometimes hours late, sometimes not at all. The food itself was deliberately disgusting. Watery soup with unidentifiable floating objects, bread so stale it could barely be chewed, water that tasted of rust and decay. When she complained about the quality, the guards would remind her that enemies of the people deserved nothing better. Some days they would bring slightly better food, only to snatch it away before she could eat, claiming they had made an error in delivery. The revolutionaries understood that controlling someone's basic needs, food, sleep, privacy, human contact, was more effective than physical torture in breaking their spirit. They wanted Marie Antoinette to beg, to plead, to abandon the royal composure that had defined her for decades. They wanted her to become something pathetic and broken before they finally granted her the release of death. But perhaps the cruelest torture was the complete isolation from news of her remaining family. She had no idea whether her daughter Marie-Thérèse was alive or dead. She didn't know what had become of her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, who had been her closest companion during the years of imprisonment. Most agonizing of all, she received no word about her youngest son, Louis Charles, the little boy who had been torn from her arms and transformed into a weapon against her. The uncertainty was deliberately maintained. Guards would sometimes hint that her family members were still alive. Other times they would suggest they had been executed. They would claim to have letters from her daughter, then refuse to show them. They would mention her son's condition, then change the subject when she pressed for details. This psychological manipulation was designed to keep her in a constant state of anxiety and grief, wearing down her emotional reserves day by day. Revolutionary officials would occasionally visit her cell, not to provide information or comfort, but to observe their prize prisoner like visitors to a zoo. They would stand outside her bars, pointing and whispering, making comments about how far the mighty had fallen. Some would ask her questions designed to humiliate, whether she missed her luxurious lifestyle, whether she understood the suffering her extravagance had caused the French people, whether she felt remorse for her crimes against the nation. These visits were carefully staged theatre, designed to reinforce her powerlessness and isolation. The officials would arrive in groups, dressed in their revolutionary finery, speaking in loud voices about the justice that awaited enemies of the people. They wanted her to see herself through their eyes, not as a human being deserving of basic dignity, but as a symbol of everything they were determined to destroy. The medical care provided was deliberately inadequate. Marie Antoinette began suffering from severe hemorrhaging, likely related to the stress and poor conditions of her imprisonment. When she requested to see a physician, they delayed for weeks before sending someone whose primary qualification seemed to be his hatred of the aristocracy rather than his medical knowledge. The doctor's examination was conducted in front of the guards, with no attempt to preserve her dignity or privacy. Her clothing, the last remaining connection to her former identity, was systematically degraded. The black dress she wore in mourning for her executed husband was allowed to deteriorate until it was barely more than rags. When she requested needle and thread to make basic repairs, she was told that enemies of the Republic had no right to vanity. Her undergarments were inspected regularly for hidden messages or contraband, another violation of her basic human dignity. The psychological pressure intensified as autumn approached. Guards began making casual references to the guillotine, describing in graphic detail how the blade worked, how quickly it fell, how the crowds reacted to each execution. They would discuss the weather, wondering aloud whether it would be sunny or rainy on execution days, as if her death was simply another item on a social calendar. Meanwhile, preparations for her trial were proceeding with predetermined efficiency. Revolutionary authorities had already decided her fate. The trial would be merely a legal formality, a public theatre designed to justify the spectacle they planned for her execution. They spent weeks coaching witnesses, preparing evidence, and crafting accusations that would satisfy the bloodthirsty crowds of Paris. The charges being prepared against her were a mixture of political conspiracy and salacious gossip. They accused her of secret correspondence with foreign enemies, of plotting to restore the monarchy through foreign invasion, of corrupting the French court with Austrian influence. But they also included more personal accusations designed to destroy her character completely. Allegations of sexual impropriety, of teaching inappropriate behaviors to her children, of hosting orgies at Versailles. Most devastating of all was the testimony they had extracted from her own son. Revolutionary authorities had spent months working on the traumatized 8-year-old boy, using a combination of psychological manipulation and threats to obtain the statements they needed. They had forced him to sign documents accusing his mother of behaviors so vile that even hardened revolutionaries found them disturbing to repeat. As October arrived, Marie Antoinette sensed that her time was running out. The guards became more aggressive in their surveillance, the officials more frequent in their visits, the questions more pointed about her supposed crimes. The machinery of revolutionary justice was grinding toward its inevitable conclusion, and she was about to become its most famous victim. But even as her captors prepared for their final assault on her dignity, something unexpected was happening within the damp walls of her cell. The woman they had tried so hard to break was finding reserves of strength they hadn't anticipated. The months of systematic humiliation had stripped away the superficial trappings of royalty, but they had also revealed something deeper, a core of human dignity that no amount of cruelty could touch. The revolutionaries had made a crucial miscalculation. They believed that by destroying the queen, they could destroy the idea she represented, but in their very efforts to dehumanize her, they were about to create something far more powerful than any crown or throne, a symbol of grace under pressure that would outlast their revolution and inspire generations to come. The morning of October 14th dawned grey and cold over Paris, but inside the conciergerie, something far darker was stirring. Revolutionary officials had spent weeks preparing for this moment, the trial that would serve as the final act in their campaign to destroy Marie Antoinette. But calling it a trial was generous. What they had planned was political theatre of the most vicious kind, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to justify the spectacle they intended for her execution. Unlike her husband, Louis XVI, who had been granted weeks to prepare his defense and consult with lawyers, Marie Antoinette was given less than 24 hours' notice. The message was clear. This wasn't about justice or due process. This was about revenge, about satisfying the bloodlust of a revolution that had already consumed thousands of lives and showed no signs of slowing its appetite for destruction. They dragged her from her cell before dawn, her wrists bound with rough rope that cut into her skin. The courtroom they brought her to was packed with spectators who had come not to witness justice, but to see the final humiliation of the woman they had been taught to hate for so many years. The air was thick with anticipation and barely contained violence, like a crowd waiting for gladiators to spill blood in an ancient arena. The judges who would decide her fate were not impartial arbiters of law, but revolutionary zealots whose minds had been made up long before she entered the room. They sat behind a wooden table, their faces masks of predetermined hatred, shuffling through documents that contained not evidence, but propaganda designed to justify a conclusion they had already reached. The prosecutor, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, was a man whose reputation for cruelty had made him famous throughout Paris. He approached his task with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed destroying human lives. The charges they read against her were a bizarre mixture of political conspiracy and sexual scandal. Accusations so wild and contradictory that they would have been laughable if the stakes weren't life and death. They accused her of sending military secrets to Austria, of planning the massacre of French citizens, of corrupting the moral fabric of the nation through her allegedly depraved lifestyle at Versailles. Each accusation was more hysterical than the last, building toward a crescendo of manufactured outrage. But the revolutionaries had saved their most vicious weapon for last. They produced documents bearing the signature of her own son, 8-year-old Louis Charles, containing accusations so vile that even some of the hardened spectators in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had forced this traumatized child to sign statements accusing his mother of sexual impropriety, of teaching him behaviors that violated every norm of decent society, of corrupting his innocence in ways too horrible to speak aloud. For a moment, the courtroom fell silent. Marie Antoinette sat motionless, her face pale but composed, processing the ultimate betrayal that her enemies had orchestrated. They hadn't just turned her son against her, they had weaponized his innocence, transformed a traumatized child into an instrument of his mother's destruction. The psychological cruelty was so complete, so perfectly calculated, that it took even her breath away. When she finally spoke, Her voice was steady but filled with a mother's anguish. She didn't address the judges or the prosecutor. Instead, she turned to face the gallery packed with the working women of Paris, the same women who had marched on Versailles years earlier demanding bread and justice. These were mothers themselves, women who understood the sacred bond between parent and child, women who could comprehend the horror of having that bond twisted into a weapon of destruction. Her words cut through the manufactured hatred like a blade through silk. She spoke not as a queen defending her crown, but as a mother defending her honor against an unspeakable lie. For one stunning moment, the carefully orchestrated theater of the trial was disrupted by something real, something human that transcended political divisions and revolutionary fervor. The women in the gallery, despite years of propaganda telling them to hate this Austrian queen, found themselves confronted with a truth they couldn't ignore. No mother deserved to have her child used against her in such a monstrous way. You could feel the mood in the room shift like weather changing before a storm. Murmurs of sympathy began to ripple through the crowd, voices raised in her defense rather than condemnation. For a brief, shining moment, Marie Antoinette had managed to pierce through the wall of hatred that surrounded her and remind her audience of their shared humanity. It was a display of rhetorical brilliance that would have made the courtiers of Versailles proud. Proof that despite months of degradation and torture, the intelligence and charisma that had once captivated European society still burned within her. But the moment passed as quickly as it had come. The judges, terrified that their carefully planned spectacle might be derailed by an outbreak of human decency, quickly moved to restore order. They shouted down the sympathetic voices, threatened the crowd with arrest, and reminded everyone present that they were witnessing the trial of an enemy of the people, not a grieving mother deserving of compassion. The prosecutor resumed his performance with renewed viciousness, piling accusation upon accusation until the air was thick with manufactured outrage. He spoke of her alleged correspondence with foreign enemies, her supposed plots to restore the monarchy through invasion, her rumoured orgies and sexual depravity. Each charge was more hysterical than the last, building toward a crescendo of revolutionary fury that left no room for nuance or human understanding. Marie Antoinette listened to this catalogue of accusations with growing exhaustion. She had been awake for nearly 24 hours, sustained only by thin soup and stale bread, her body racked with pain from the hemorrhaging that had plagued her for months. The damp stone walls of her cell had given her a persistent cough that echoed through the courtroom whenever she tried to speak. Her hair, once her pride and styled by the most fashionable artists in Europe, hung limp and grey around her shoulders like a shroud. Yet despite her physical deterioration, there was something unbroken in her bearing that infuriated her captors. They had expected her to crumble under the weight of their accusations, to beg for mercy, to provide them with the spectacle of a broken woman pleading for her life. Instead, she sat with the same composed dignity that had carried her through 20 years of court intrigue at Versailles. Her back was straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her eyes focused on some distant point beyond the hatred that surrounded her. When given the opportunity to respond to the charges, she spoke with measured precision, addressing each accusation with the careful logic of someone who understood that reason might be her only weapon against revolutionary madness. She pointed out the contradictions in their evidence, the impossibility of their timeline, the obvious fabrication of documents that supposedly proved her guilt. Her responses were so methodical, so clearly reasoned, that they only seemed to enrage her accusers further. The trial continued for 2 days, but the outcome was never in doubt. The judges had made their decision before she entered the courtroom, and nothing she could say would change their predetermined verdict. This wasn't a legal proceeding, but a ritual sacrifice, a public execution of character designed to precede the physical execution that would follow. Every question was loaded, every piece of evidence was manufactured, every witness had been coached to provide testimony that supported the narrative of her guilt. As the hours dragged on, the absurdity of the proceedings became increasingly obvious. They accused her of crimes that would have required supernatural powers to accomplish, being in multiple places at once, orchestrating complex conspiracies while under constant surveillance, maintaining secret correspondence despite having every letter intercepted and read. The charges contradicted each other so blatantly that even some of the revolutionary zealots in the courtroom began to shift uncomfortably. But logic had no place in this theater of hatred. The revolution had fed on blood for so long that it had developed an insatiable appetite for destruction. Marie Antoinette wasn't just a person to be judged. She was a symbol to be annihilated, a representation of everything the revolution claimed to oppose. Her death had been decided long before her trial began, and these proceedings were merely the legal formality required to satisfy the pretense of justice. The all-male jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their inevitable verdict: guilty on all charges. The sentence was death by guillotine, to be carried out the following morning. When asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, Marie Antoinette simply shook her head. What was there left to say? The machinery of revolutionary justice had ground to its predetermined conclusion, and nothing she could do would change the outcome. Back in her cell that final night, she refused the meal they offered her. Food seemed pointless now, a connection to a world she would soon be leaving behind. Instead, she spent her remaining hours writing letters to the few people who still mattered to her: her daughter, her sister-in-law, anyone who might remember her as something more than the monster her enemies had created. Her final letter was addressed to Madame Elizabeth, her sister-in-law and closest companion during the dark years of imprisonment. In it, she poured out her heart about the forced testimony of her son, begging Elizabeth to help the boy understand that he had been manipulated, that he bore no responsibility for what had been done in his name. She wrote of forgiveness, of understanding, of the hope that someday her children would know the truth about what had happened to their parents. The letter was never delivered. Revolutionary authorities intercepted it, filing it away with other documents that might complicate the narrative they were constructing. They couldn't allow any evidence of her humanity to survive, any proof that she was capable of love, forgiveness, or maternal devotion. The monster they had created in their propaganda couldn't be allowed to show human emotions, even in her final hours. As dawn approached, Marie Antoinette prepared herself for the final act of the drama that had consumed her life. She had survived months of systematic humiliation, psychological torture, and physical degradation. She had watched her family destroyed piece by piece, her children torn from her arms, her husband executed before her eyes. She had endured accusations so vile they defied comprehension, betrayal by her own son, and the complete destruction of everything she had ever known or loved. But she had survived it all with something her enemies couldn't touch, a core of human dignity that no amount of cruelty could break. They could kill her body, but they couldn't destroy the grace and composure that had defined her since childhood. In just a few hours, she would face the guillotine with the same poise that had once carried her through the glittering ballrooms of Versailles. Her final act of defiance would be to die as she had lived, with dignity intact, humanity unbroken, and spirit unbowed. The revolution thought it was about to claim its greatest victory. Instead, it was about to create its most enduring symbol of grace under pressure, a testament to the indestructible nature of human dignity when faced with ultimate adversity. The woman they had tried so hard to break was about to show them something they had forgotten in their orgy of violence. That true nobility comes not from birth or title, but from how one faces the worst that life can offer. The morning of October 16th arrived with the kind of grey, oppressive sky that seemed to press down on Paris like a heavy shroud. Inside the conciergerie, Marie Antoinette awoke to what she knew would be her final dawn. The guards who had tormented her for 76 days now moved with different energy. No longer the casual cruelty of jailers, but the focused efficiency of executioners preparing their stage. What happened next would reveal the true depths of revolutionary hatred, but also something far more powerful that her enemies never anticipated. They had spent months trying to break her spirit, to transform the former Queen of France into something pathetic and broken. Instead, they were about to witness a display of human dignity so profound it would haunt their consciences for generations to come. The first humiliation came with the dawn. Guards burst into her cell carrying a bundle of coarse white cloth, the simple shift of a penitent, designed to strip away every last vestige of her former status. The elegant black mourning dress she had worn since her husband's execution was torn from her body, taking with it the final connection to her identity as queen and widow. They forced her to change in full view of her captors, denying her even the basic courtesy of privacy in her final moments. But the revolutionaries weren't finished with their calculated degradation. They had saved their most symbolic cruelty for last. Charles-Henri Sanson, the chief executioner of Paris, entered her cell carrying a pair of rough iron scissors. Without ceremony, without explanation, he grabbed handfuls of her hair and began cutting. Each snip of the blades was deliberate, methodical, designed not just to prepare her for execution but to strip away her femininity, her dignity, her very identity as a woman. Her hair, once piled high and decorated with jewels that caught the light of Versailles' crystal chandeliers, fell to the stone floor in grey clumps. This wasn't the careful grooming of a royal hairdresser, but the brutal shearing of a condemned criminal. They wanted her to look like what they claimed she was. Not a queen, not even a woman, but something less than human, deserving of destruction. The binding of her hands came next, and here Marie Antoinette found her voice for one final protest. They tied her wrists behind her back with coarse rope, pulling the knots so tight they cut into her flesh. "You did not bind my husband's hands," she said, her voice carrying across the cell with surprising strength. It was a simple statement, but it contained volumes, a reminder that even in death, Louis had been granted certain dignities that were being denied to her. They tried to erase Marie Antoinette completely, stripping away her crown, her children, her dignity, and finally, her life. But in that final moment of grace, a simple apology to her own executioner, she achieved something her tormentors never expected. She proved that true nobility cannot be guillotined, that human dignity transcends any throne, and that sometimes the greatest victory lies not in surviving, but in how we choose to face the end.